Tensions on the front lines in Ukraine had dropped considerably for about a few months. Both sides of the war had greatly reduced offensive operations, but a few days ago, Bakhmut, the center of the clashes, was active again. After a long break, the Ukrainian armed forces signed a historic step in Bakhmut. Russia's defense ministry said yesterday that it faced Ukrainian attacks on a 102-kilometer section of the front near the besieged city of Bakhmut. The Russian Ministry of Defense said today that up to 40 tanks and more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were launched into offensive operations in the direction of Soledar in the Donetsk region. Ukraine announced gains in Bakhmut after Russia denied it. Ukraine's military of defense has claimed it has regained ground in Bakhmut, a rare advance after months of crushing Russian gains in Bakhmut. In this regard, the Kiev authorities announced that the Ukrainian forces had advanced 2 kilometers around Bakhmut in just 1 week as a result of the striking offensive operation. It was the 1st Assault Battalion of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, the Special Forces unit that led the attack. According to the commander of this battalion, the territorial gains of Kiev took place near the Seversky-Donetsk Canal between the villages of Ivanivka and Kurdyumov. The Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, Anna Malia, confirmed these statements in a post on Telegram. Anna Malia announced that Russia suffered significant troop losses as Ukraine gained 2 kilometers without losing any position. She said geolocated images show successful operations by Kiev forces in the west and southwest of the town of Donetsk near Kromov and Belahora. Ukrainian sources said his forces destroyed the 6th and 8th companies of the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian 3rd Army Corps near Bakhmut and advanced 1.6 miles along a 1.9-mile front line. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade posted a video on social media that allegedly showed the conflict with Russia's 72nd Brigade. Andriy Beletsky, the founder of Ukraine's Azov regiment, said that the 6th and 8th divisions of the Russian brigade were completely destroyed. The Ukraine 3rd Assault Brigade was formed from the Azov regiment at the end of 2022. In other words, the 3rd Taras Brigade of Ukraine is the Azov regiment, which consists entirely of elite fighters. Kraken, one of the strongest troops of the Azov regiment, led the Ukrainian counterattack. Statements from Ukrainian officials signaled a change in momentum in Bakhmut. Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry stated that the Ukrainian forces accelerated their attacks in the north of the region. On the other hand, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky reported that he met with senior military commanders and that General Oleksandr-Syrskyi's forces stopped the Russians and even repulsed the Russian troops in some directions. In his nightly speech to the Ukrainian people, Zelensky praised his troops and noted the low morale of the Russian forces. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the millionaire owner of Wagner, Russia's private military contractor who often criticizes the Russian army, once again drew attention by losing ground around Bakhmut and revealing his forces fighting for the city. In a video statement on the subject, Prigozhin mocked the report of the Russian Ministry of Defense, which claimed that his forces were regrouping to take more favorable positions, noting that the Russian troops had effectively fled. In fact, the Ukrainian forces carried out actions that confirm their statements with a historical offensive operations they carried out in Bakhmut in the past few days. The likelihood of this being true had already increased after Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin's bluff against Russian President Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, because Prigozhin had announced that he would withdraw his mercenaries from Bakhmut for additional military ammunition and supplies. The Wagner leader shared a striking video where he made almost insulting remarks to Putin and Shoigu. As a result, Putin and Shoigu provided the Wagner forces with the support they wanted, so the Wagner boss continued to hold his troops in Bakhmut. However, this chaos between the Russian administration and Prigozhin gave the Ukrainian army an incredible advantage. The Ukrainian armed forces had a serious preparation period in Bakhmut and its environs, thanks to the hesitation caused by Prigozhin. And finally, the expected offensive of the Ukrainian forces took place. Melitopol exiled Mayor Ivan von Fedorov reported a massive explosion southeast of Bakhmut. While it is not known what caused the explosion, it turned out that the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 14 attacks on Russian troops and Russian military equipment in this area. Alongside the airstrikes, Ukrainian forces claimed to have destroyed 9 Russian UAVs. The Ukrainian armed forces also announced that it has successfully launched attacks on dozens of Russian military targets southeast of Bakhmut, including artillery, ammunition depots, and air defense equipment. After months of stalemate, the Ukrainian counterattack, aided by newly arrived Western weapons, had a cold shower in the Kremlin. Some Russian military bloggers made statements confirming the offensive of the Ukrainian forces. Pro-Kremlin Russian war correspondent Sasha Katz stated that the Ukrainian counterattack has begun and that there's been remarkable activity on other front lines as well as in Bakhmut. Sasha Katz, citing reliable sources, suggested that Ukrainian tanks were advancing on the Kharkiv road toward the Russian border. Katz added that there are low loaders on the columns carrying the Western tank models used by the Ukrainian forces. In other words, Kiev had decided to aggravate the situation on the northern front in parallel with the start of offensive actions on the flanks of Bakhmut. Alexander Simonov, another Russian war correspondent, wrote in Telegram that Ukrainian forces had captured several square kilometers near the village of Bodanivka, near Bakhmut. Based on all these statements, the Ukrainian armed forces was both conducting a striking offensive operation in Bakhmut and trying to keep the borderlines from the northern side of the country away from Russian troops. Of course, there are important contributors to the launch of an effective offensive by the Ukrainian forces on such a large scale. These are Western and U.S. military aid. According to international intelligence reports, close to 100% of Western and U.S. military aid has already reached Ukraine. In fact, an unnamed senior military official who drew attention to Western and U.S. aid made critical statements about the situations in both Bakhmut and other front lines of Ukraine. A senior U.S. military official reported that Ukrainian forces gained a great advantage by hitting targets such as Russian army arsenals, command centers, armor and artillery systems in Bakhmut. Based on the statements of so many high-ranking military and political officials, how did the most important person evaluate the successful offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut and other front lines? Former Russian commander Igor Girkin said in a statement that Russian President Vladimir Putin does not have any goals or strategies in the Ukraine war. Rising military losses on the battlefield have made Putin the subject of criticism among Russian nationalists who often support the idea of taking Ukrainian territory but question the effectiveness of Moscow's military leadership. Igor Girkin was one of the people who had the most ardent statements on the subject. Girkin, who came to the fore during the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and was convicted of participating in the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 last year, is one of the leading voices among Russian nationalists. For this reason, Girkin's statements on the subject are of great importance, stressing that Putin cannot have a war strategy if he's not clear about his goals. Girkin explained that this is one of the reasons why Ukraine achieved the last victories. In a separate post, Igor Girkin reported that he believed that Russia would be defeated soon as the Russian army did not manage to defeat Ukraine in any way during the winter-spring campaign. Girkin's words came as the battle for control of Bakhmut continued as the Wagner group reversed course in their plan to leave the city, which had witnessed some of the most intense clashes of the entire war. Ukrainian Commander General Oleksandr Skirsky confirmed these statements of Igor Girkin. Oleksandr Skirsky stated that the Ukrainian forces repelled Russian troops in multiple attempts to attack the city. So what kind of response is expected from the Russian side against these successful steps of the Ukrainian armed forces? According to the Kiev intelligence chief, Russia does not have the ability to make another attempt at a serious attack anywhere in Ukraine. Major General Kyrylo Budanov, head of Ukraine's main intelligence agency, stated that as of today, Russia does not have the military, economic, or political potential to create another attack attempt. Budanov claimed that Russia's missile stocks were declining, but the Ukrainian intelligence chief added that Moscow is still fully capable of conducting serious defensive operations. Actually, Budanov was right about this. The Russians are trying to accumulate certain stocks and keep them ready in order to thwart the offensive. But the reality, according to most intelligence reports, is that the Russians have reduced their stockpiles to almost zero in the coming hours. There is some good news. As you know, over the last several days, the situation in the vicinity of Soledar has been very tense. The Russians tried to capitalize on the Ukrainian tactical retreat and breach the Ukrainian defense using momentum. They conducted a heavy assault on the salt mines area in the central part of the city and managed to get a toehold there. However, today the Ukrainians prepared an attack feast, returned control over the Arkansas tourist and sanatorium areas, and pushed the Russians back to the eastern part of the city. And this is how it happened. Last time I told you that the Russians reached the Ukrainian defense line but did not breach it. The Russians largely continued to operate in the buffer zones to the south and east of Soledar. Also, geolocated footage from the region showed the presence of a Wagner group fighter at the Artem Sold tourist area in central Soledar. The Russians tried to expand control over the region and started attacking Ukrainian positions near the salt mines. 1, 2, 3. Despite these attacks, Ukrainian forces have been able to hold the ground and repel the advances of the Russian forces. As the Russian forces decreased, the number of attacks around Bakhmut transferred more Wagner forces to the Soledar area and opened more lines of attacks here. The Ukrainians responded reciprocally. According to the Centralian reports, the Ukrainian military has transferred 2 additional platoons to the area to ensure the stability of the situation. After that, the Ukrainian 46th Air Mobile Brigade launched a counterattack over the night with the goal of restoring control over the tourist area and railways. As a result, they regained lost positions to the north of the railways. So now the Russians have no opportunity to go into the residential area. A Ukrainian military correspondent posted a geolocated picture of himself in front of the Soledar salt mines, indicating that the Ukrainian troops are now in control of this part of the settlement and continue to repel Russian attacks towards the mines. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces emphasized that Ukrainian troops are not withdrawing from Solidarity. The Ukrainian General Staff has also reported that Ukrainian troops are successfully defending the settlement. Russian analysts provide a similar evaluation of the situation. They largely agree that at the moment there is no evidence of the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine. Some sources also say that the Ukrainians attacked the Russian checkpoints in the eastern part of the city, but further details will be known later. When it comes to the area around Soledar, the Russians continued conducting combat reconnaissance operations in an effort to set conditions for attacking Ukrainian flanks. First of all, the Russians continued fixing Ukrainian troops from the north in order to assault other settlements on the line. And today they tried to advance in the direction of Krasnopoliansky and Seal Station. Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians were repelled, never reaching the approach us, while Russian sources claim that the operation was successful as they established control over the European amount and now have direct fire control over a section of a highway to Blahodad. If you look at the 3D map, we can see that the slope of the mount can hardly be detected. The Russians have been moving here relatively freely since they captured Yakovlevka, so the only new achievement could have been establishing a permanent presence in the region. However, this is highly doubtful, especially given that Russian sources themselves also report on Ukrainian airstrikes. A Russian source reported that the Ukrainians are using 5 Su-25 and 2 MiG-29 tactical aircraft to fire at the offensive areas of the Russian forces in the Soledar area, in particular European amount. Lastly, some sources indicate that the Wagner forces are fighting on the streets in Krasnohorivka and that they have taken complete control of Horodnia. The Institute for the Study of War assessed the situation and concluded that there are not enough observable confirmations to corroborate these extensive claims. So no changes to the front line happened here. Overall, the Ukrainians restored full control over their main defense line inside Soledar, and they have reportedly conducted more counterattacks east of the city. Such actions signified that the Ukrainians attempted to break the momentum of Russian advances along the entire perimeter, which should result in faster stabilization of the front line. On top of that, heavy engagement of aviation in the region strongly suggested that the Russians are given no chance to advance towards the Ukrainian flanks. An army's greatest need to continue fighting is weapons, but things are not going well for the Russian army. The ammunition stock of Russian army is decreasing day by day. Russian soldiers are facing major problems due to the decline in ammunition stocks. The information coming from the battlefield today showed how big the problems the Russian army was experiencing. We follow all developments in the battlefield for you for the continuation of independent journalism. You can support us by using the Super Thanks button below the video. Let's start if you are ready. There are many reasons for the ammunition crisis in the Russian army. The first reason for this crisis is the problems in Russia's governance. The Putin administration in Russia is implementing repressive policies. A problem that occurs in all repressive regimes is also occurring in Russia. Merit crisis. Putin is putting his most loyal people in critical positions. Many of these people do not have enough knowledge and experience in their work, but when they brief Putin, they always say that things are going well. This is leading to a massive rot in Russia's state institutions. When Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he called a meeting of Russian commanders and defense ministry officials. At this meeting, Russian commanders told him that Kiev could be captured in just a few days. Putin then asked to be informed about the status of ammunition stocks, but the officials, not wanting to reveal the failure of his mission, said that Russian ammunition was sufficient. Putin came out of this meeting thinking that Russian army was the most powerful in the world, but this was not the reality. Soon after the Russian army began its invasion of Ukraine, the truth began to emerge. The number of weapons in the Russian army was not enough for a long war. The Russian army started to distribute very few bullets to the soldiers because it was feared that the stock of the bullets would run out. All arms factories in Russia increased their production, but none of these production was enough because the Ukrainian army managed to establish a huge superiority on the battlefields. The Ukrainian army has been conducting strategic operations targeting ammunition depots of the Russian army. The missiles and weapons in these depots began to be destroyed. The losses of the Russian army were increasing day by day. The Kremlin was especially alarmed by the huge drop in the number of tanks. The strongest part of the Russian army was its tanks. These tanks have very effective cannon systems. The shells fired from the tanks could kill many soldiers. The Russian army thought that no army could resist these tanks, but the Ukrainian army discovered their weakness. The barrels of the Russian army's tanks could turn 360 degrees, so they were prepared for any attack from the environment. However, the total inclination of the tank's Paris was only 30 degrees. This left the Russian tanks completely vulnerable to air strikes. Russian tanks have very strong armor systems. However, when the tank's barrels are damaged, it becomes impossible to fire. The Russian military did not pay much attention to this problem because it was not thought that any fighter jet could carry out attacks precisely enough to target the barrel of a tank. The Ukrainian army also has very fighter jets. This led Putin to rely too much on tanks. But there was one thing Putin did not calculate. Ukrainian army drones are highly accurate. These drones are supported by cameras and artificial intelligence systems. This makes it possible to hit the target with pinpoint accuracy. Ukrainian soldiers managed to damage the barrels of Russian tanks using these drones. This renders the Russian tanks unusable. These clever attacks by the Ukrainian army are causing great damage to the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is also conducting operation against Russia's weapons stockpiles, according to the latest data shared by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. The total ammunition losses of the Russian army are as follows: 3,436 tanks, 6,723 armored fighting vehicles, 2,463 artillery systems, 488 XV-253 air defense equipment, 303 aircraft, 289 helicopters, 2098 operational tactical level UAVs, 73 cruise missiles, 18 ships and boats, 5,330 automotive equipment and tankers, and 246 special equipments. The exact number of ripples and bullets destroyed is unknown. However, it is known that the biggest ammunition problem of the Russian army is in guns and bullets. The Russian army tried an interesting solution when it did not have enough weapons to distribute to the soldiers. Arms depots from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were opened. All the weapons in these warehouses were distributed to the Russian soldiers. However, most of these weapons were rusted. In addition, the effectiveness of these weapons, which were produced according to old technology, was very low. These weapons, which often jammed, caused the Russian army to suffer more losses. Russian soldiers received only 50 rounds of ammunition for these weapons. Such a small number of shells has left Russian soldiers helpless in some war zones in Bakhmut, where fighting has been going on recently. Both armies are fighting at close distances by digging trenches. British intelligence announced that something very interesting happened during the fighting in this area. According to British intelligence, Russian soldiers started using shovels when they ran out of bullets. Many Russian army soldiers were killed in hours-long fighting in backwoods. The surviving soldiers continued the fighting, using the bullets of that soldiers. But after a while, the Russian soldiers ran out of bullets completely. Desperate Russian soldiers hid in the trenches. But in this area, there were about 100 meters between Russian trenches and the Ukrainian army trenches. Thinking that all the Russian soldiers in the trenches were dead, the Ukrainian soldiers started moving towards the Russian trenches. They planned to infiltrate the Russian army trenches and seize Russian weapons. But when the Ukrainian soldiers entered the Russian trenches, they found something very interesting. Russian soldiers tried to attack Ukrainian soldiers with the shovels they used to dig trenches. Russian soldiers trying to hit the Ukrainian soldiers with shovels looked like desperate. Ukrainian soldiers managed to neutralize Russian soldiers who were fighting using shovels. However, they were all quite surprised that the Russian soldiers had to use shovels. This incident revealed the accident of the ammunition crisis in the Russian army. Russian soldiers don't even have enough weapons to fight. Russian soldiers want more bullets and modern weapons, but the Putin administration cannot do anything about it. Russia cannot buy weapons because of the sanctions imposed by Western countries against Russia. The Russian army, whose stockpile of weapons is dwindling day by day, is having difficulties to continue the war. Experts analyzing the reports published by British intelligence emphasize that the Russian army may soon have to withdraw from this war because Russia cannot find enough equipment to fight. What do you think about the ammunition crisis in the Russian army? What do you think about the Ukrainian army destroying Russian ammunition depots? Do you think Russian soldiers will mutiny if they don't have enough ammunition? How do you think the ammunition crisis in the Russian army will affect the war?